Hello everyone. So today, I'd like to talk about a budget deck that I built around a commander from the newest set, March of the Machine. And that commander is Errant and Giada. Errant and Giada? Honestly, I don't know. But what I do know is that this commander is really good for flying tribal. So, as a budget deck, I've kept the price under $45 at the time of recording using Scryfall's listed prices. This includes the cost of basic lands, doesn't include the cost of shipping, and if you're interested in playing with this deck, adapting this deck, or doing anything with it, a link will eventually be in the description down below when YouTube has decided that I am a real human person and not a bot. Until then, the link will actually be in my About page on the channel. Anyway, let's get into it. So, Errant and Giada. I'm going to use the hard G for consistency reasons. They are a 2/3 human angel for 1 generic, a white and a blue. They have flash and flying, and have 2 abilities. The first lets you look at the top card of your library at any time, and the second allows you to cast spells with flash or flying from the top of your library. These last 2 abilities basically make it so the top of your library is an extension of your hand when Errant and Giada are on the field. So our first goal with this deck is to build a large, evasive army of flyers. We'll also make use of some Anthem-like effects to buff our creatures with flying, use the top of our library as an extension of our hand, and finally, we'll make use of some scrying and milling effects to help us change the top card of our library. So let's just get a couple ramp sources out of the way. First up, Marble Diamond and Sky Diamond. These are some fairly efficient mana rocks that tap for white and a blue respectively, but enter the battlefield tapped. We have Wayfarer's Bauble, an artifact that can be tapped and sacked to let you search your library for a basic land, which enters the battlefield tapped. And finally, Ornithopter of Paradise, a 0/2 flying mana dork that can tap for any color. Now let's get into that flying army. First up, Ornithopter, a 0/2 flyer that costs nothing to cast. Then, for 1 white mana, we can cast the 1/1 Segovian Angel and 1/2 Swooping Lookout, both with Vigilance. We also have Hovermere, a 1/2 with flying and vigilance, and Malkator's Watcher, a 1/1 with flying and vigilance, and when it dies, you get to draw a card. Then we have Fogbank, a 0/2 flying wall with Defender that also reads, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by Fogbank. So this is basically fog for itself and whatever creature it's blocking. Next we have Artificer's Assistant, which lets you scry whenever you cast a historic spell, of which historic spells are your artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. Then we have Azorius First Wing, which is a 2/2 flyer that has protection from enchantments. Cloud of Fairies, which is a 1/1 flyer. However, you can effectively cast this for free as it only costs 2 mana to play, and when Cloud of Fairies enters the battlefield, you can untap up to 2 lands. Then we have Skycat Sovereign, which gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying, and given we're doing flying tribal, this card has the potential to get pretty big. It can additionally make a 1/1 white cat bird creature token with flying for the cost of 2 generic, a white and a blue. Then we have Watcher of the Spheres, a 2/2 flyer that lets us cast creatures with flying for 1 less generic mana. Additionally, whenever another creature with flying ETBs under our control, Watcher of the Spheres gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn. Then we have Joyous Familiar, a 2/2 flyer that lets us cast historic spells for 1 less generic mana. Then we have Peregrine Drake, a 2/3 flyer that is somewhat similar to Cloud of Fairies in such that it costs 5 mana to cast, but when it ETBs, you can untap up to 5 lands, so provided you have enough land to cast it, you can basically cast it for free. Alright, so we have a Myria Angel, which is a 3/3 with Landfall. Whenever a land ETB is under your control, you can create a 1/1 bird creature token with flying. You know, just bump up the number of flyers in our army. Then we have Moonfolk Puzzlemaker, which is a 1/4 flyer that lets you scry whenever it's tapped, which can help us set the top of our deck a little bit. Cyani? Eye of the Storm, which, whenever it attacks, lets you scry X, where X is the number of attacking creatures you have with flying. As most, if not all of the creatures you'll have on the board will have flying, X can be very large and let you dig quite deeply into your library. Then we have Sphinx of Foresight, which will let you scry at the beginning of your upkeep. This is useful because upkeep happens before our draw step, so if we know that there's a card on top of our library that we don't want to draw, we can change it out right before drawing. Next we have Cavalier of Gales, which, when it ETBs, lets us draw 3 cards, and then we put 2 cards from our hand onto the top of our library in any order. This can help us set the top of our library for the next couple draws. And additionally, when Cavalier of Gales dies, we shuffle it into our library and scry 2, which gives us even more library top setting. Next we have Vago the Watcher, who lets us draw a card whenever we cast a spell from anywhere other than our hand. Given that we're able to cast flash and flying creatures from the top of our library, and we have a lot of flyers in this deck, You'll be able to draw pretty consistently with Vega on the board. Next we have Thieving Magpie, which lets you draw a card whenever it deals damage to an opponent. Then we have Tide Skimmer, which lets us draw a card whenever we attack with 2 or more creatures with flying, which for this deck will happen almost every time we attack. Mulldrifter, which lets us draw 2 when it ETBs, or it can be evoked for 2 less than its general casting cost. However, you sacrifice Mulldrifter after it's ETB'd. Then we have a Loyal Drake, which lets us draw a card at the beginning of our combat provided we control our commander. Up next we have Windreader Sphinx, which is a 3/7 that lets us draw a card whenever we attack with a creature with flying. We next have Spirit of the Spires, which gives our other flying creatures +1 toughness. Then we have Sprite Noble, which has a static ability giving our flying creatures +1 toughness so long as it's on the board. Then it has an activated ability giving our flying creatures +1 power until the end of the turn. Then we have Jubilant Skybonder, which gives our flying creatures spells your opponents cast to target this creature cost 2 more generic mana to cast. Up next is Windstorm Drake, which gives our other flying creatures +1 power. Thunderclap Weaverin, which has flash and gives our other creatures with flying +1/+1. And Empyrean Eagle, which also gives other creatures we control with flying +1/+1. Then we have Angel of Invention, which has an Anthem effect giving all other creatures we control +1/+1. It also has Flying, Vigilance, Lifelink, and Fabricate 2, meaning when it ETBs, we can either put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, or create 2 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens, but they won't have flying. Next, we have Angelic Overseer, which, as long as we control a human, Angelic Overseer has Hexproof and Indestructible. This is extremely easy for us as Errant and Giada is a human angel, so our commander fulfills this requirement. Then we have Platinum Angel, which simply reads, you can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. We also have Sephira, Sky's Blade, which has an alternate casting cost of 1 white mana and tapping 4 untapped flying creatures that we control. Sephira has flying and lifelink and gives all our other flying creatures indestructible. And finally, for our main army of flyers, we have Angel of Destiny, which has flying and double strike and actually provides us with an alternate win con as it reads, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. At the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, so in Commander 55, each player Angel of Destiny attacked this turn loses the game. Given our army is full of evasive flyers, you should be able to deal a significant amount of damage by the time you get Angel of Destiny on the board. So there's a non-zero chance that you'll be able to make people lose the game pretty quickly. However, before we stray too far away from flying synergy, there's 2 additional cards I'd like to talk about. Favorable Winds and Magus of the Moat. Favorable Winds is an enchantment that gives all of our flying creatures +1/+1, and Magus of the Moat makes it so that creatures without flying can't attack. Given we have pretty much an entire army of flyers, this won't affect us much at all, but this easily could shut down our opponents. Now, given that Errant and Giada let us look at and cast from the top of our libraries, there will come times in our games where we'll want to move the current card off of the top of our library without drawing it, and we can achieve this through scrying and self-milling. First up, we have Darksteel Pendant, which effectively lets us scry 1 when tapped for 1 mana. This was printed before scry became a keyword and hasn't been reprinted since, but it's not an expensive card. We also have Crystal Ball, which for 1 mana, you can tap it and scry 2, again letting us set the top of our library. We can also clear the top of our library using Deranged Assistant, which, when tapped, lets us mill a card and additionally gives us 1 generic mana. We also have Excavated Wall, which lets us mill a card when tapped for 1 mana. Goshintai of Lost Wisdom, which is actually a flying creature, but at the beginning of our end step, we can pay 1 generic mana to target a player and have them mill X cards, with X being the number of shrines we control. Goshintai is also the only shrine we have in this deck, so X will always be 1. And finally, we have Coral Colony, which, when tapped with 1 and a blue, can mill a target player for X cards, with X being the number of creatures we control with Defender. If you're intending to use this for yourself, however, you may wish to be careful, as there are a few other cards in this deck with Defender. Now, we have a handful of creatures that inherently give us some card draw, but it wouldn't hurt to have some extra card draw on the side. Given that our army is fairly evasive, equipments and enchantments such as Goggles of Night, Rogue's Gloves, and Combat Research are great because our creatures are likely going to be able to deal combat damage almost every turn. Combat Research also has the additional effect of, as long as the enchanted creature is legendary, it gets +1/+1 and has Ward 1, giving it a little bit of extra protection. Then we have Thopter Spy Network, which makes a 1/1 flying Thopter token at the start of your upkeep if you control an artifact, and lets you draw a card if one or more artifact creatures you control deals combat damage to a player. Arcane Encyclopedia, which lets us draw a card when tapped for 3 mana. And Winged Words, which for 2 generic and a blue lets us draw 2 cards. However, you'll almost never pay that price, as this spell costs 1 less to cast if you control a creature with flying. Now that we've gone over spells for our own board, let's go over some interaction spells so that we can deal with the things that our opponents are casting. First up, we have Runic Shot, which is a sorcery for 1 white mana and can be kicked for blue, and it lets us destroy a target tapped creature, and if it was kicked, it lets us scry 2. Next we have Arrest, which is an enchantment which makes it so the enchanted creature can't attack, block, or use its activated abilities. And we have Gust of Wind, which lets us return a non-land permanent that we don't control to its owner's hand, and lets us draw a card. You'll also almost never pay its full price, as it costs 2 less if we control a creature with flying. We also have blue in our commander's color identity, and blue is the color of counterspells. Therefore, we can make use of spells like Counterspell, Dissipate, Cancel, and Absorb. Counterspell counters a spell for 2 generic mana. Dissipate counters a spell for 2 blue and a generic, but the spell that's being countered would be exiled instead of being put into its owner's graveyard. Cancel counters a spell for 2 blue and a generic. And Absorb lets us counter a target spell, gives us 3 life, and costs 2 blue and a white. And finally, we have the quintessential white interaction spell, Swords to Plowshares, which for 1 white mana lets us exile a target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Okay! Now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's wrap it up by talking about our land base. First up, let's talk about our Scry lands. We have Crystal Grotto, which taps for generic and can convert mana into any color, Zhalfirin Void, which gives us generic mana, and Temple of Enlightenment, which taps for white or blue, but it ETBs tapped. All of these let us scry 1 upon entering the battlefield. Next we have some cycling lands in Lonely Sandbar, which can be cycled for 1 blue mana, Secluded Steppe, which can be cycled for 1 white mana, and Irrigated Farmland, which can be cycled for 2 of any mana color. Then we have Azorius Chancery, which is a bounce land that taps for white and blue. However, when it ETBs, you need to return a land you control to its owner's hand. We also have Prairie Stream, which taps for white or blue, and ETBs tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Port Town, which taps for white and blue, and can ETB untapped provided you reveal a plains or island card from your hand. We also have Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. These cards are reskins of each other, and they can be sacrificed to search our library for a basic land which we can then put onto the battlefield tapped. And finally, we'll fill out the rest of our deck with 13 plains and 14 islands. Now finally, let's look at that price. And as you can see, this deck rings in at just under $45. Again, this includes the price of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but it doesn't include the cost of shipping. If you're interested in playing with or building this deck, the link will eventually be in the description down below once YouTube's decided that I'm actually a person. Until then, it'll be in the About section of my channel. Thank you for watching, give this video a like if you liked it, maybe consider subscribing if you want more budget commander decks. Thanks again, see you in the next one.